Thanks for tuning in for today's episode of Forage Focus. Today I'm joined by guest Clifton Martin, the Muskingum County Educator for Agriculture and Natural Resources. Clifton and I will discuss a new weed in our area called Spotted Knapweed. Stay tuned to hear more about ways to identify and control this weed in your landscape. Thanks for watching. I am here in Muskingum County with Ag and Natural Resources Educator Clifton Martin. Clifton, thanks for being on the show today.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
As we talked about earlier, our topic for today is a weed that is slowly making its way into southeast Ohio, and that weed is spotted knapweed. I've had a lot of encounters with spotted knapweed in Noble County this year. How about you, Clifton?
Oh, I've seen it around. Yeah, it's along a lot of roadsides. Not too hard to actually find. There's a lot of purple colored flowers out there too, so it's easy to mistake for others.
Right.
But yeah, it's here.
I saw a lot of it on my way to your office. So the route between Caldwell and Zanesville has a lot of spotted knapweed.
Absolutely.
And that's one of the most common places to find it, right?
Along a roadside, yeah, absolutely. We see it, and we do, if we drive around and look, we could probably find some pastures right now that have it in. But probably the primary place to be looking to learn to recognize this weed is just to get out and look for purple flowers along the roadside. Spend a few minutes because there's a couple different purple flowers there could be, a couple different plants. But there's a good chance you could find some spotted knapweed in those places.
Okay. So we've heard the name and you've seen some pictures. But once we get out there and try to look at it, what are some things we might easily confuse spotted knapweed with?
Red clover is one of the primary plants that I hear it commonly compared to. Because when you're in a vehicle and you're driving along, certainly we're trying to keep our eyes down the road, okay, but as you're making those glances on the roadside, that's one of the first flowers you see is that red clover. And the red clover blooms, we're used to seeing it. It's always there. And one of our other colleagues, he tells the story. For years, he thought he was just seeing red clover along the side of the road, and then all of a sudden he realized that there was something else there, and it was that spotted knapweed in with it. So the red clover has, and we'll talk some more about this, but a closed, almost ball-shaped type head, as opposed to the spotted knapweed, which is more of an open form.
We do have a little bit here, which on the way to the office we saw a lot of spotted knapweed. So just for color comparisons, the color between a red clover and spotted knapweed is very similar.
Absolutely, yeah.
That flower shape is very different.
Now, chicory, that'd be another plant that we see a lot on our roadsides. The color is a little bit more distinct between the chicory and the spotted knapweed. So that chicory is going to hold more of a purple, darker purple, maybe into a shade of blue color to it, whereas that spotted knapweed, it's purple but more into a shade of pink, perhaps. So chicory is one. Chicory, clover, knapweed, they could all be in the same space. The third plant I commonly hear a reference in comparison to would be a thistle. Biggest difference probably between the thistle and the spotted knapweed is size.
Okay, and which one's bigger? How are they different size-wise?
Well, that thistle could certainly get to be the size of a grown person. Spotted knapweed might be about 1 foot to 3 feet tall, and the thistle does have an open form into the flower, but it's a larger flower, maybe maybe 1.5 inches across, maybe more. It's bigger, basically, much larger. So it's actually very difficult. If you have the two next to each other, it's plain as day, which is which. So again, it's probably the red clover, the thistle, and the chicory again are going to be the three plants that I see that potentially could be confused with it.
Okay. I mean, I noticed earlier this year I kept thinking I was seeing spotted knapweed because I was watching for it, and I was actually finding Canada thistle, which has a similar flower shape but different color.
Okay.
And completely different growth. It's spiky as big
Yeah,
leaves,
absolutely.
But just watching for it, I kept seeing these flowers that were similar shapes but not the right flower.
Right.
And it blooms at a different time.
Yes.
So this one comes on a bit later than Canada thistle does. But once you see it and you get familiar with it, you see it everywhere, don't you?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, it's not too hard to find. I can step out of the doors of this office. Within a few steps, I can find these plants. So you can probably
Now we
find every
know.
plant that we've discussed so far.
Now we know it's here. We know what it looks like. And with practice, hopefully our viewers would be able to figure out those things as well. How did it get here in the first place? This is a relatively new weed for our area. So
Yeah.
where did it come from?
Well, it would have come from the western part of the country first. And before that, I would suppose it came from the Old World. So I don't know that we call it a New World plant necessarily. It'd be a European in origin, or European in origin, I believe, is where it's from.
Seems like most of our accepted and also
Yeah.
dreaded plants have came from.
Absolutely, and we're not quite, and part of that is just the ecology of the space that we live. We're not prepared to handle these particular plants, and there aren't predators or just kind of the natural ecological forces that would just keep it in check. So, we say the western part of the state, so I'm thinking more like the Colorado, the western plains, and so it's moved this direction. Checked a few places, and I believe Missouri about 2002, and I'm sure there's a little bit of give and take here in the dates, but 2002 is when they started to really be talking about it in that area, and about 2008, 2010 would be about when they really began to notice it here. Usually when we give those dates, often I think it's been in the space for some time, but it's really about when we noticed it.
Right.
So about that 2008, 2010 is when I saw some records indicating that it was kind of newly on the scene. And of course now we have it, and we're struggling with some ways to manage it. And one of the great difficulties then is, and what makes it so prolific is, it is a plant that puts out a lot of seed. Different numbers on these amounts exist, but 25,000 seeds per plant is one that you see. I think I saw 1,000 seeds per seed head as another number. So with numbers like that, it's easy to reproduce, and it does reproduce by seed. That's
So there's your seed head for spotted knapweed. When it starts getting dry, we'll try not to open this up so that we don't have spotted knapweed growing in the office.
right. Probably another pretty important point to cover here is that it is a perennial, sometimes described as a biennial.
Can you explain the difference between those two things for maybe a viewer that's not familiar?
So the biennial plant is, in most cases, what we're describing when we use that word is a plant that we might see germinate in the fall
Okay.
and go through the winter before it puts up a seed head. So it's almost 2 seasons is really what you're looking at for biennial. The perennial plants, I mean, these are the plants that, what's the best way to describe it? I mean, it's opposite of the annual, your trees, your shrubs. You plant it year after year after year, it's there, it's present. So I've seen spotted knapweed described both as a perennial and a biennial. And what we see then is in the fall, we'd be looking for a rosette, what we call a basal rosette. In other words, it's low to the ground, it's very small, it would be down into the grass. Maybe something like a burdock or a plantain or plantain would be the type of plant that would be similar. In other words, maybe about a 6-inch long leaf. Now these leaves are described as deeply lobed.
Okay.
So think like an oak leaf, deeply lobed. Whereas we mentioned burdock, that's not going to be a lobed leaf. That's going to be more close to what we call entire. I'm not quite sure if that's the specific what we'd find in the taxonomy, but there's a big difference between
lobed versus entire. Yeah, burdock's definitely entire versus lobed.
So again, in the fall, right? So that basal rosette is down in the grass, low to the ground, and then we see this flower head, and the rest of the plant that next season begin to emerge and grow.
Okay, so why don't the livestock that we have in our pastures eat it?
Well, there's better things out there.
Okay.
Our grasses, our forbs, clovers. That's more palatable to the livestock. It's what they prefer, and that's what we see is that the animals go to the plants that they prefer to eat first. There's going to be less forage value. Now, I think if you force the animal, they would probably eat it, but then it's this question of, are they actually getting the energy they need from it? Is it going to result in a rate of gain that is productive? So it's really not a plant that contributes well to our forages and works well in our species configuration. The other issue, too, is that it can, like some of these other weeds we have, suppress the grasses around it. Another term that comes up with spotted knapweed and some others is the allelopathic effect.
Okay. What is that?
What is that? Think of tree of heaven. You get one tree of heaven in place in a couple years. All you have left is tree of heaven and nothing else. It essentially puts out chemicals or compounds through the roots around it, shuts down the plants that could be near and competing for space, and the only plant then that can survive in that condition is the spotted knapweed. So it has the potential to shut down the plants that we actually want to have in our pastures and replace the pasture with itself.
That doesn't sound like a good situation. From what I've read, there has been some success in the western states with getting small ruminants to eat it, sheep and goats, but they have not successfully gotten cattle to eat it. And the stage we're seeing it in now, good luck, nothing wants to eat it.
Yeah,
that's this point, right?
That's a really important point. When we talk about things like fiber and lignin, once you have a plant that's putting up a seed head, they're really putting their energy into that hard, tough tissue that the animal does not want to eat. So I think when we talk about control options, certainly when you have that basal rosette, more vegetative, that's really the window we want to be in. Even if you're trying to encourage an animal to use it as feed in that forage, or even if you're having to resort to chemical controls, that basal rosette stage is the time when any kind of control is really probably going to be effective.
So before you've noticed that the seed head is there.
Yeah, so it's difficult because sometimes we don't notice it till we see the flower. But when we see the flower, we've missed a pretty important window for control. So we talk about prevention, we talk about eradication or renovation, and in most cases we want to try to be in that prevention stage, which means learning to recognize that basal rosette is pretty important, because you're basically shifting into a renovation phase once you have a lot of these plants in your pasture and having to do control. So that basal rosette, again, we talked about the differences between the flower, but I would say it's pretty important to get out and be scouting when you walk your fields, to be training your eye to be looking for the spotted knapweed as a basal rosette.
Right,
Yeah.
and if you have noticed that you have some of these flowers, you definitely want to be on the lookout early next year, because if you have
Absolutely.
flowers now, you're going to have more seed, right?
Right, and one other control method we might talk about would be mowing. We use mowing for multiple purposes. Keep our grasses vegetative. We can sometimes mow to keep the weeds down. So will mowing work for spotted knapweed? It could be a suppression technique. It's not going to be an eradication technique because some of these flowers will survive below the cutting height.
Bummer.
Right. So there'll still be some that go to seed if you just mow. It might be fewer than if you left the whole plant, of course. So it might suppress the population. It's not going to eliminate it.
So how many years do you think I need to really be treating it? If I see it this year and I go after it early and I feel like I've gotten good control, do I not need to worry about it anymore?
I think you're definitely on a 2 or 3 year minimum plan to try to eradicate spotted knapweed.
Okay. With our audience, we've talked some before about some of the characteristics of weeds that make them persistent are
Right.
that they could be dormant for multiple years. Have you seen information about how long knapweed seed might stay?
I have seen that knapweed seed can be dormant for 5 years. I recently found another publication that said 8 years. So you're in that 5 to 8 year window. I said that 2 to 3 year minimum control, but again, you have to be watching for that extended window period of time. They don't tolerate tillage necessarily.
Okay.
But again, the seeds can persist in the soil for a long time.
Okay. There's an activity that's been going on a lot in southeast Ohio and other places in Ohio that might be a good spot for spotted knapweed to get started since it likes disturbed areas that are then kind of left alone. We have quite a bit of pipeline installation and construction related to that, and a lot of heavy equipment that's been moved throughout.
Well, and I think you kind of get into that conversation about what is renovation and what sort of things do we need to do. It's really about establishing a good stand of the plants that you want to have there. So taking that time to think about what you need to do for soil sampling, fertility, because you want to be encouraging the plants that you want, the grasses, the legumes, so that they have an advantage in order to compete with anything that might come in like a knapweed. So kind of your number one priority is to try to get that good stand in your forage, in your field, along your pipeline right away, whatever it is. We oftentimes talk about, if you don't change your practices, if you're going out to do a renovation, pasture, whatever it is, if you don't actually adjust any of the practices by using something like a soil test to make changes to pH or other fertility, you're just going to end up with whatever you had there in a couple years. Management actually does need to be a little bit thoughtful. There needs to be some strategy in terms of trying to cultivate what you want to have and maintain.
And from the sounds of it, knapweed's not picky about growing site conditions.
No.
As far as fertility goes.
It'll show up, yeah. Yeah, and again, it's about trying to give, when we talk about fertility, we're trying to maximize what we can out of the plants that we want and give them every advantage to grow, knowing that something like spotted knapweed can easily show up if we're not careful.
So what type of producers or landowners or people in our communities need to be hearing more about spotted knapweed?
Really just about anybody. Now, certainly more of us are going to have an eye for this than others, especially if we're in the farming community. Haymaking, pasture fields, those are some of the places that we're highlighting and trying to target because it can spread pretty quick in those places. If you're soybeans or corn, most of your practices are going to probably eliminate this, but you'd be watching your field edges maybe. It'd just be like along a roadside edge. Potentially anybody who's out there who has those responsibilities for mowing, and not just along the road, but just your own property at home. As those mowers move and knock down flowers and any potential seed heads, you're spreading those seeds.
thinking about the patterns of how that's spread in Noble County from what we've seen is, for example, last year we had high populations around the Seneca Lake area. And then coming on down through places like Quaker City and Batesville. And it seemed like a lot of things came from the lake. And thinking about who's coming to the lake and where they're coming from, are there ways that they could bring seed with them and not be aware?
Well, absolutely. I mean, because these are seeds that can travel, so as we think about boats and anything else that's in the water, it's often recommended as a practice to be washing off equipment. You know, if you got trailers that are getting parked on a road edge or a parking lot edge, again, you could be knocking seed into those trailers, and there's lots of ways. And that sort of example, it's
a complex.
It's complex. I mean,
question.
we're not going to necessarily.
We're not blaming you, boaters.
I can't really sit here and tell people how to
as you travel,
clean their trailers all the time.
As you travel from one place to another, if you're in a region where spotted knapweed is, be aware.
Be aware of it, and think of it. There's other examples of this that we see. So we're talking about spotted knapweed, but we could be talking about kudzu bug. We could be talking about the spotted lanternfly. I mean, some of these things can just attach to a side of a pickup truck and get transported 200 miles away, and so it's part of the risk of travel.
Living in a connected world.
Yeah. So highways, you know, kind of a lot of our main, and I would hear, you know, here we're along State Route 60, and I would hear the comment, well, I watched it gradually move north up State Route 60, right? So, you know, those types of places are conduits for the spread of invasive species like this.
Okay. So it's a plant that can take foot in places where other plants are struggling and opportunistically travel as well. It's a forb, which makes me think that deer might be accustomed to eating it, and we know that deer travel a lot as well. So can viable seed be passed through the digestive system?
You know, I don't actually know the answer to that question.
I think that I read recently, at least with the shepherds, they've been advised to quarantine animals if they're in a mature stand.
I mean, it's a scenario that we do see, and we can talk about it with lots of different animals. So I think it would be reasonable to expect that would occur. I mean, I hear about different, you know, horse manure, swine manure, livestock manure, whatever situation. We know that things can transport through manure. And I would say we need to behave as if that could occur between fields. So absolutely, that's something we teach in an extension we really like to promote, management intensive grazing. So we have all of our fields and our paddocks, and we have a strategic process by which we move between them. And yeah, absolutely, if you had spotted knapweed in one paddock or one field, having that quarantine approach may be necessary.
Okay. I've had some questions about spotted knapweed come in from beekeepers in the county, and their question has been somewhere along the lines of, it seems like my bees really like spotted knapweed. Is it advisable for them to keep it?
No, it's not. It's really not. I mean, I absolutely understand that question and the perspective and where they're trying to come from. And we do get into lots of conversations about trying to support pollinators. We agree that's very important to do. I would say in the case of this plant, we need to be looking for alternatives, and that spotted knapweed should not be one that we encourage. Essentially, if you encourage spotted knapweed, long term you're probably looking at the suppression of other pollinators, pollinating plants, at the expense of trying to promote spotted knapweed. So I really don't see any validity in that argument.
Okay. So the big piece of the puzzle, we're trying to promote biodiversity when we think about pollinators, and knapweed is going to essentially reduce diversity over time.
That's what I would see happen. Yeah. The other thing to keep in mind is I believe it's not on the noxious weed list yet, but it may be in the
I
future.
think it is in some other
And maybe
states.
other states, absolutely.
But in Ohio, I think it's still pending at this point.
Okay.
But if it is noxious, how does that change the approach?
It pretty much means you eliminate it. I mean, you can't plant it. You're not supposed to transport it. There's lots of rules about what you're supposed to or what you can't do. It's basically a target for trying to manage and eliminate from the landscape with whatever tools you have possible.
Okay. So thinking some more about control and the
Yeah.
outlook for the future, what are the methods of control, and how should you proceed through what to try first and how to
Right.
go from there?
First thing you want to do is again, and we try to preach this in a lot of different scenarios, is scout. Learn to recognize what the weeds are. Make sure you know what you should be seeing first of all, and so if it stands out, to spend some time trying to make sure you can ID it. If you see spotted knapweed, try to pull it. So and let's be realistic, right? Maybe you see 5 plants. Try to pull 5 plants. If you see 1,000 plants, you're too late. Okay. But every once in a while, I'll hear somebody say, "Yeah, I saw 1 or 2 plants." They need to get out there and pull those 1 or 2 plants, because that 1 or 2 is what 3 years from now will turn into 1,000 or more. So that's kind of our first step, and it's that preventative approach. And so part of that is trying to mow and scout and pull and just manage. But if you get beyond that, you run into this chemical controls. What can we do with our herbicides? So it's a broadleaf plant, which basically means if there's other clover that you're trying to maintain in the field, you're going to take those out as well. So maybe the kind of a halfway step here between pulling and having to do a full field spray would be spot spraying. Much like some people might manage thistles. Mm-hmm. They have to get out there and spot spray sometimes. That might be the type of situation here. So you're looking for something that's going to be a broadleaf herbicide. So your Roundups might work, but your Roundups are going to destroy everything in that spot. We'd be more into that 2,4-D, Tricloper, a couple other ones out there. We can pull up the charts and share those as well.
They might vary regionally based on what you've used in the past.
What you've used and what some of the rules are locally as far as what you have available to you. I mean, here in Ohio, we don't have too many restrictions that we're particularly concerned about, but it's important to maybe check the label. Certainly we talk about this in a lot of cases, because not every broadleaf herbicide is the same or targeted toward the same plant. And so we always make sure to ensure that people read the label and make sure that spotted knapweed is on that label for control.
Okay. If anybody has any additional questions about identifying spotted knapweed, figuring out ways to treat it, where should they go?
Check with your extension offices. We can find some information pretty quickly. We've got several different types of handouts and things that we can pass along. A lot of information is available on pasture weed control, and we're always happy to share that.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today and your time. We appreciate it, Clifton.
You're welcome.
Thanks for watching Forage Focus. Join us next time in October.